Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's nice to be here. Thanks for holding down the Zoom Zendo, Scott. I don't know if I had the camera arranged very well, if you could really see who was here, but I know see a few here. I don't remember wave at the laptop in my Soto training, but we invented a new form. So that's good. When I started, it would have been unimaginable to have any technology in a Zendo. It would just be like horrifying. So that changed. So we've had quite a wonderful series of talks on women ancestors, and thank you to Raisla last week and John the week before and many others in the prior weeks, Desiree, Hannah, Scott, Bob. Lots of voices trying to reflect on these important stories, important root lineage people that get left out of the dominant history, you know. So finally, it's my turn. The whole series on women ancestors was sort of in reaction to me wanting to do a whole series on male ancestors, which I then abandoned. So I get to finally do a talk on a woman ancestor. So I thought I'd do one that I know, you know, that I got to practice with. One of my teachers. Her name was Zenkei Blanche Hartman, and probably too far away to see, so I'll bring the book out. There's a very nice picture of her in Zazen, very much how I remember her, in this book of collected teachings put together by her student, Earthlyn Emmanuel, who's also a good writer herself. Blanche wasn't a terribly scholarly person, you know, perfectly smart person, but she was not the kind of person to sit down and write a book, so in the great tradition of Zen, she didn't have to. She just had to get old and die, and then her students took care of it. So you know what to do. Blanche Hartman and her husband Lou were both priests, married priests, were living at Green Gulch Farm Zen Center when I showed up there towards the end of my 20th year. Curious young man, drawn to this for some reason that I never understood. I had been dabbling with practice for a while, and then I heard somewhere, this was before the internet, maybe I looked in the phone book, I don't know, that there was this place north of San Francisco. So I went up there initially for a week on my spring break from school, and then I took a year off from school because I really wanted to have more time. So that's where I met Blanche. She and Lou were just very vibrant members of the community. And there were a lot of people who had been there a long time. The place was founded in the early 70s, and I was there in the mid to late 80s. So it's been happening for a while. And quite a number of the people who I was interacting with had been there from the beginning. But somehow Blanche and you just felt like they were really planted there, you know, foundations of the community. They were a bit older than most of the other long-term residents. I looked it up and figured that she was 60 years old when I met her. I'm on the cusp of 60 years old now myself. So everyone else must have been in their 40s and early 50s, and they all seemed plenty old to me at 20. And that kind of fits the story of San Francisco Zen Center, which is one of the major ways that this school of Zen came to America, through a Japanese priest named Shunryu Suzuki, usually called Suzuki Roshi. And they did the same kind of thing with his teachings, and created a wonderful little book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which he also didn't write, but it's all collected sayings of his. So Blanche's book is in that same tradition. And like Norman Fisher, my teacher did, Blanche and Lou first connected in the early 70s with Mel Weitzman, Mel Weitzman in Berkeley, who was a very early Zen teacher, one of Suzuki Roshi's first disciples. Suzuki Roshi had sent Mel to Berkeley to start a center in 1967. And Norman has some great stories about his first encounters with Mel that I'll tell you another time. So Blanche started with Norman in Berkeley with the teacher Mel Weitzman. But she and Lou must have moved to San Francisco right away because Norman never met Suzuki Roshi, actually. He's a little sheepish about this if you ask him, He kind of says, I just kind of never got around to it, and then he died, But Blanche must have met him right away because she had some fabulous stories about Suzuki Roshi as her first deep root teacher besides Mel. And as you probably know, Suzuki Roshi died, fairly suddenly from cancer, having founded this vibrant and fast-growing community of kind of scruffy-looking hippies who are also acquiring property at a tremendous rate, It took us 35 years to get our little place on Cedarwood, and by the early 70s, they had a 100-acre farm and, a multi-million-dollar kind of valley in Marin County, a large, graceful building in San Francisco, and another valley deep in the mountains behind Big Sur for their Tassajara Zen monastery. Of course, real estate was a little less expensive then, but still. They were going for it. And in a perfect world, Suzuki Roshi would have lived another decade to kind of consolidate what would happen next, Things are a little unstable, right, when they're growing fast and when there's a lot of excitement. They're energized, they're powerful, but they're a little unstable. And unfortunately, Suzuki Roshi left the place even more unstable because he put, at the end, all of his focus on one of his students, a fellow named Richard Baker, who by all accounts was a quite brilliant guy, but also pretty unstable. And Blanche has great stories about practicing with Richard Baker as well. He was a good teacher for her. So I've appreciated hearing her stories about him as well. One of the stories I remember she told me about Suzuki Roshi, which I guess is a famous story because Norman mentions it in his introduction to the book. It was in that first year at San Francisco with him. She felt like she was really applying herself to learning how to sit zazen. Do the right posture. She had very good posture. Follow your breath just so, really focus your mind, work on the mind wandering, stay right here. And so eventually she goes to Suzuki Roshi in Dokusan and says, I think I'm really learning how to do zazen. And Suzuki Roshi leapt into a rage and said, you don't do zazen. Zazen does zazen. Rang his little bell, kicked her out. This made a big impression on her. Very upsetting, but also deeply illuminating, like a really turning point for her. She told a similar story about Richard Baker, and it connects to how Blanche had always felt a little awkward in San Francisco Zen Center. Because unlike the other students, mostly all of them in their 20s, empire founded by 20-somethings, can you imagine? Good thing they said a lot of zazen. One wonders what else was happening. But anyway, Blanche was in her 40s, and really from a different era, They were post-war people, and she was a World War II person. In fact, she had worked as an airplane mechanic during World War II. She was an unusual, strong woman in the educational system and the marketplace as well. She studied chemistry and wanted to be a chemist, and the exigencies of the war, I guess, made her into a mechanic as well. So she felt a little awkward at first, maybe for a long time. She still would talk about feeling a little awkward when I met her, got to know her a bit. So at one point, she says Baker Roshi saw her in the hallway at San Francisco Zen Center, kind of looking around. And he said to her, kind of sidled up to her and whispered to her, "Don't do anything for anybody else." And that was another recommendation. Don't do things for others' eyes or something like that. Yeah, it was a more pithy way of saying that. Ironically, because of her very non-stereotypical roles in life as a woman in the 30s and 40s, and now we're up to the 60s and 70s, she was invited by Suzuki Roshi to learn how to do Zen sewing. A nun from Japan came over at Suzuki Roshi's invitation, named Joshin-san. I never met her, but there are many, many stories about Joshin-san, who brought this style of hand sewing that we do here to this day for our ceremonial garments. So where the sewing becomes a meditation practice in itself, and an interesting revealing challenge of where your mind is at and how you feel about everything. And as you sew, you learn a lot about who you are. It's very strange and mysterious and frustrating and wonderful and horrible. Really great practice. But anyway, Blanche was beside, being a chemist and a mechanic and never having sewn in her childhood, took to this, and she became the sewing teacher for San Francisco Zen Center in the 1970s and continued to do that until her death. Which is another reason why I got to know her. I'll just tell you about that in a minute. So our Chris Burkhardt is a Dharma heir of Blanche in that way, but Chris never met Blanche. She learned sewing through a few of Blanche's students. But anyway, Green Gulch, she was warm and welcoming, but also a bit formal. And she didn't really chit-chat. Her husband Lou was a gregarious chit-chatter, so it was one of those relationships in which one half of the couple does the chit-chat, right? And the other can just be quiet. There's a couple chortling right here. What is that about? But one thing that impressed me deeply about Blanche is how deeply she held the forms. I know last week Reza was talking about the forms, especially about silence. Just like we do when we're at sesshin, overnight sesshin, overnight meditation retreats, where we're silent, and we want to acknowledge each other. When we cross in the path, we stop and bow. And so they did that practice all the time at Green Gulch. If you pass somebody on the paths, and there are lots of paths, you stop and bow. And most people, like you or I would probably be, were on their way somewhere, had something to do, only had so much time, and so their little stop and bow was like, But Blanche would really stop. She would plant her feet deeply into the earth, bow from the waist, looking straight ahead, shouldn't smile at me or anything like that. Put her hands back in shashu and continue. And it just really struck me. Like, wow, slowed me right down. What a teaching. Blanche came up to Bellingham to teach with us once, to help us sew. I don't know if any of you were here then. And because we were preparing for a jukai up here, and I was really curious if we could do the sewing up here this time. The first ever jukai cohort we had, so this is when we have to sew because we're going to do a special ceremony that involves a little bib-like rakusu. First cohort we had was 2 people, me and Florence Kaplow, in the early 90s. And then there was 1 or 2 more individual people, Bob Penny, maybe John Wiley. And all of us went down to San Francisco or to Green Gulch to get this done because there was no sewing teachers, in Washington State that we knew of, or Oregon, we had to go to California. So I thought it'd be great to have Blanche come up and help us learn how to do this up here. And we did. We had a weekend sewing retreat and started rakusus, and that all went fine. But the strong memory I have is like one of those times, and I've had this a number of times, where what really strikes you deeply about a teacher, like a moment you really learn from, is when they say or do something you don't agree with. Do you know what I mean? That kind of shocks you a little bit. It makes you think. And maybe later you come to agree with them or see the wisdom in what you're saying, or maybe you eventually realize, oh, no. But really made me clarify, made me think. So anyway, we were at the second Dharma hall we had on State Street in the Masonic Lodge with its fabulous bright red floor. Probably pretty soon after we moved there. And we only had one room, so sometimes it was set up like a zendo, sometimes it was set up to socialize, sometimes it was set up in a circle or something, depending on what was happening or who was there. And so we'd kind of shoved the cushions aside and brought tables in so we could sew. But the cushions were still there, and Blanche wanted to sit zazen before we started sewing. So I grabbed the cushions and I'm pulling them in, I'm kind of making a circle in between the sewing tables. And she asked me if we faced in or out. So it's a little confusing at the moment here because we have been facing in towards each other, but it's more traditional in Soto Zen by a mile to face the wall. In fact, zazen is often called wall sitting. And we had been facing the wall there as well. But somehow this just felt like a different situation, and I didn't really want to be staring at the sewing tables or something, so I said to her, well, sitting in seems friendlier. And she said quite sharply, zazen has nothing to do with friendliness. I'm like, oh, okay, facing out. And as I said, I grumbled to myself, I didn't like being corrected. And I thought I was right, Zazen's, and probably after the zazen, if I'd been courageous enough to say to Blanche, well, actually zazen's nothing but friendliness, I bet she would have said, that's right too. But instead I just kept to myself, a little grouchy. This trivial little thing, who cares really which way you're facing, right? But the great thing about our practice is we get all worked up about things that don't matter, and we learn about our minds and our narrow views and our egotism and our tenderness, right? And our desire to be agreed with and receive strokes from people we admire, right? And here I had a correction. But I don't know, maybe that's not that impressive to you, but it really struck me like a little bit like her story of Suzuki Roshi talking to her, like, no, it's not what zazen's about. It's not about you, it's not about friendliness, it's much bigger than that. And it's about your life, and it's about friendliness, both. Sometimes I think about Zen having sort of two intertwining paths. This was a recent thought, like last decade maybe. That in Zen, the way we're doing it here, there's both a path of healing and a path of transformation. And the path of healing is just like it sounds, and it really is that, isn't it? To be in good company, to slow down, what a relief, huh? To have a friendly community, to be invited to do things and help out, and just to feel this mutual appreciation we feel with each other. There is something about the sitting, that's deeply healing, calms us down, helps us sort ourselves out. But that's not the whole thing, right? The other half here is the path of transformation. The path of realizing, we never were wounded in the first place, It was all just kind of a trick of our consciousness, that everything's actually totally okay. To transform into Buddhas and meaning realizing we always were Buddhas. So maybe my little incident with Blanche and the sewing weekend, facing in, path of healing, facing out, path of transformation. And we need both. But the closest times I spent with Blanche were actually at Tassajara Monastery, a few years before this sewing retreat, I think. She was there for the first time as a teacher, which is a big deal in San Francisco Zen Center, to be the teacher for the monastic practice period. It's kind of like the creme de la creme, moment of Zen training. Long days, deep in the wilderness, dark, quiet. It's really the archetypal Zen scene, So definitely whoever's leading that should be fully enlightened, and Blanche, I think, was feeling the pressure. She didn't feel so fully enlightened. She had recently become co-abbot of San Francisco Zen Center, the first female abbot of a Western Zen center that we know of. She actually shared that position with Norman. And you can't lead the Tassajara practice period unless you are or have been an abbot of the community. So I can't do that. In her Dharma talk, she talked a lot about how nervous she felt, how uncertain she felt, how she was doubtful that these talks were any good at all. And it was just so hardening, because I was there, now I'm 25 or something, doing my first long monastic training periods. I'd done a few medium ones at Green Gulch already, but it was a little intimidating, And so it was really lovely to have the teacher also be a little intimidated, She had been there many, many times as a student, of course, over by then 25, 30 years. But one of the strange things that happened that relates to my favorite Blanche story of all is Tassajara is a remote, off-the-grid place. They originally bought a fairly scrappy resort that had been built like in the 30s or something like that. So these little wooden buildings were mostly pretty old, and the modern infrastructure that had been added was pieced together and pretty funky and a little long in the tooth even then. And it turned out that their long-term maintenance guy had recently quit, apparently in some kind of a huff. And so there was kind of nobody there who really knew that much about plumbing and carpentry and electronics and stuff to, kind of keep the place going. They were in a bit of a lull. And I had been working in carpentry and was pretty handy, and so bizarrely I was like the best person to fix Tassajara. It's really quite surprising to me. I didn't think I was there for that. And what happened was the water system failed. Water came down to the community through some long plastic pipes from a spring up the valley. And it went through this little kind of curlicue pipe thing that had to do with sterilizing it. There was a UV sterilizer. And it had silted up. There was no silt trap, so it was a bit of a flawed system. So anyway, they were quite concerned. No water is pretty much it for the practice period. We would all have to have left. And I said, I'll try. So there I am, cutting open their water system and getting the silt out and trying to glue it back together again, hoping it won't leak. And I was doing all this during the work period. There is a work period in the middle of every day. The days start early there, 3:40 or 3:50 in the morning, several periods of zazen, breakfast, a couple more periods of zazen, and then a work time. And then after lunch, sometime, I forget when, I think there's a little break after lunch, and then you go back to this very rigid and intense schedule of meditation. It's every day. So the schedule is a big deal, and the schedule is in our bones, and you follow the schedule. If you don't, someone has words with you pretty quick. So I'm trying to put this back together, and I'm running out of time. And I kind of can't stop, There wasn't going to be dinner if I didn't fix this thing. And I'm pretty stressed out about it, And then who shows up in her robes but Blanche? And she takes off her robes and says, "Hand me a wrench." I said, "Blanche, you're supposed to be the teacher." And she says, "I'm better at plumbing." So we fixed it together. And missed the next period of zazen. I don't know what they thought in the zendo. So that's my favorite moment with Blanche. Let me read you a few of her words, and that'll be enough for tonight. Here's one on the path of healing. People have talked to me about how much they appreciated Lou, my late husband. My response has been, if you appreciated Lou, what were the qualities you appreciated? Can you bring those qualities alive in yourself? If you enjoyed his humor, can you find your own humor and bring it out? If you enjoyed his kindness, Can you find your own kindness? And bring that out. When you find that you appreciate someone, look into what it is that you so like about that person. Oh, I wonder if I could be like that. That's pretty nice. We can encourage each other to cultivate our most beneficial qualities. I have a sign on my door. You must be what you want to see in the world. If there's something you want to see in the world, you make it happen. As you practice together, when you see a quality that warms your heart, learn from it. Bring it out in yourself. These are all human qualities that we all have. Kindness is not something that only a Buddha has. It's something that only the Buddha has when we're all Buddha. Let me say it again. Kindness is not something that only the Buddha has. If it's something that only Buddha has, then we're all Buddha. The capacity for kindness is in each of us. Will we cultivate it? Will we bring it forward? All of these qualities that we appreciate in the people around us, and we can appreciate those qualities and cultivate them by making them alive in the world through our own effort. And as we become more intimate with each other, we can help each other polish up those qualities that we like, those qualities that lead to harmony and affection and appreciation. We can make the Sangha what we want it to be by making ourselves who we want to be. That's a lot of power, and you have it. Isn't that last line great? That's a lot of power, and you have it. So also the path of transformation is there too. Here's another bit. And these are all different pieces of newsletter articles and Dharma talks, arranged with titles, but they're titles chosen by her student, probably. The title for this one is, Each One of Us Contains the Whole Universe. Linji Yixuan, a Chinese Zen Buddhist monk, said, "People who try to do something about what's outside themselves are nothing but blockheads." Maybe it's more accurate to say that the people who imagine that there's something outside of themselves at all are blockheads. But we can't fix it if we put it out there. We can't liberate out there. We can only liberate in here. It turns out that that's enough. What's apparently out there and what's in here look different only on the surface. When we look around us, we see joy and sadness. We see suffering and delight. We see the longing to be touched and the fear of being touched all together. We see longing to be free and fear of being free, side by side. And in ourselves, we see the same. The differences between us are so minuscule when compared to the ways in which we are all the same. We have this tendency to focus on the differences rather than the similarities, and that is why we become confused. Each of us is complete and contains the whole universe. Each of us is caught in the delusion of being separate. And those of us who have at some point woken up to our connection with everything, we all forget it from time to time and fall back into our old habits of clinging and avoiding our old separate self. And each time we do, we suffer. We suffer. The process of waking up needs continual renewal, just as each breath we take nourishes us and brings us alive. We feel it metabolizing and taking life-giving oxygen to all of our cells. But if we hold our breath and don't breathe out, pretty soon there's nothing left to nourish us. We need to breathe out and breathe in again. One of the great miracles to me is this incredible way in which I breathe in what the plants breathe out, and the plants breathe in what I breathe out. The body can be nourished by the roots, stems, and leaves and seeds of the plants. This body also, and all animal bodies and plants, can be nourished by the excrement of the plants. I don't know if oxygen is actually excrement to the plants, but that's a great line. And this amazing, amazing interconnectedness of everything with everything is a never-ending source of fascination for me. So we can't breathe in once and stay alive. And we can't wake up once and stay awake. Pretty soon we fall back asleep. So this practice of ours is never-ending, continuous effort. The never-ending, continuous joy of waking up and waking up and waking up. That's a nice mission statement, huh, for us? Yeah, very beautiful. One more. This one was titled, Falling in Love All the Time. What is our motivation for our practice? Well, here we are. We are living in this world, and we notice there is suffering. And we develop, as the Buddha did, a wish to know how to help people in their suffering. Because compassion is a natural, normal human response to suffering. And so we want to know how to ease suffering. We don't want to go around looking for trouble and feeling dismal and dull when there's a beautiful world all around us, when beautiful people are all around us. I practice with many beautiful people who are interested in the Dharma and concerned with how to live their lives. And I'm falling in love all the time because of how they practice Buddha's teachings. It's hard not to love people who are loving themselves. It's hard not to love people who are in pain and need help and support, or who help me when I am in pain and I need help and support. The Buddha wasn't pointing out our human condition in his teachings in order to make us feel bad about ourselves. He was saying, look, this is what's happening. So how can we live a joyful life in the midst of the fact that this doesn't last forever? Well, in the first place, since it doesn't last forever, we might as well enjoy it right now while we have it, right? So anyway, I recommend this book. I'll have to donate it to our library once our library is up and running, because probably won't read it too many more times. By Blanche Hartman. She died maybe 7-8 years ago, something like that. I can't remember. One of the things I'm really looking forward to when we set up our temple in Cedarwood is we'll have again our little altar to the ancestors. And we have a picture of Blanche there, and Suzuki Roshi and Kobanchino, Edie's first teacher, and I mean, we need a picture of Edie, huh? Yeah. And Buddha and Dogen and some other characters, But part of the routine there is every time the zendo gets opened, an offering is made to the ancestors too. So that'll be nice to have that again. They've been in their box for a while.